you want to do flagpoling, it is not a move to be taken lightly. If it goes wrong bad. This is an option of last resort for a lot of folks, especially for those who have very limited options to extend, for example. So we really only consider this if there are no other options. If you come there and ask for something and you're not even sure what you're asking for, they might not necessarily like you. So you're already strike one, and then your documents are incomplete, strike two. So they're not going to like you. And if they're not a fan of you, you're going to have a hard time.
All right, before getting into this video, huge disclaimer. Any information provided on our YouTube channel is of a general nature and is for educational or informational purposes only. It's not intended as a substitute for professional advice or a guarantee of outcome. Should you decide to act upon any information on this channel, please proceed with caution. So viewers are advised to seek specific legal advice by contacting immigration lawyers that are active members of a law society in Canada or immigration consultants registered by ICCRC. And if you want to make sure that you're up to date with the latest changes, please visit the Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada website. All right, if you're watching this video, you're probably interested about a topic that's both crucial and timely for many temporary residents in Canada: flagpoling. And hey, at any point in time, if you'd like to jump to specific topics discussed in this video, check the timestamps in the description below. So first of all, what exactly is flagpoling and what does it involve? Is it even legal? Why do so many people choose this route, especially when facing imminent visa expiry? To answer these questions and more, we have an experienced Canadian immigration lawyer who will walk us through the ins and outs of flagpoling. So without further ado, let's welcome a leading expert in Canadian immigration law. He helped Bea and I become permanent residents in under 2 years, and ultimately he helped us in becoming Canadian citizens in just 4 years. Ladies and gentlemen, longtime friend and supporter of the channel, the founder of LJD Law, Lou Dangzalan. Lou, welcome back. Thank you for joining us again.
Hi, Daniel. Nice to see you again.
It's always a great time to chat with you. I know a lot of people are talking about this topic, and it's we're very fortunate that you're chatting about this right now. Okay, so we'll get straight into it. First of all, Lou, flagpoling. Can you explain what flagpoling is in the context of Canadian immigration?
Well, it's a colloquial term basically used by a lot of people who practice immigration and the authorities as well. It essentially means that you're leaving Canada to touch the flagpole at the opposite side of the border, which is usually the United States, because that is the largest and longest unprotected border between Canada and another country. And then returning to Canada. And while returning to Canada at the port of entry, where you face an immigration or a border services officer, you make an application for an immigration document such as a work permit. That is what is flagpoling.
Okay, and is it legal? Why do people do this in the first place?
Oh, absolutely, it's legal because there are circumstances when individuals, or foreign nationals, I should say, are allowed to apply for a work permit at the port of entry. So even if you're flying, for example, from a different country, such as the United States, or if you're coming in from Europe or Asia, if you have the right type of passport, which is usually a visa-exempt passport, you are allowed to apply for a work permit upon entry. There is a weird exception for those who are normally visa required to enter Canada that allows them to apply for a work permit at the port of entry. And this is usually done through flagpoling. It is sort of like a product of the interpretation of the regulations. In other words, it's a bit of a loophole. Is it legal? Yes. Do border officers like it? Not so much, because it does add a lot of friction at the traffic between the United States and Canada, but it is a part of their job. So what professionals such as myself do, who work in immigration law, do is that we don't really exercise this option for our clients unless it's absolutely necessary or if it's in their best interest to do so.
Okay. Can you walk us through, because seems like from my research, seems like a straightforward process where a temporary resident in Canada would just cross the border and just make a U-turn. I don't know how it works. Can you walk us through the step-by-step process of flagpoling?
Right. So it's not so much a U-turn per se. I mean, it is a way of describing it. However, you do need to make an attempt to enter the United States. And what instructions I typically give my clients who attempt this is that they would try to leave Canada. They should leave Canada and make an attempt to enter the United States. And when they talk to a border services officer over at the U.S. side, they would inform the CBP or the Customs and Border Protection of the U.S. That they are flagpoling, and they're usually very much familiar with this, and they'll give you a return slip, basically that you're being refused entry to the United States. And this works for folks who even do not possess a visa to enter the United States because it is, as I mentioned, a legal maneuver. However, we try to limit the instances when this is done because one small mistake could lead to catastrophic consequences. So, before doing this, make sure that you're actually qualified to do this, and make sure that you have a very clean file. The best way is to talk to an immigration lawyer who has experience in assisting clients who do this. Um, why is it something that a lot of people do? Daniel, you said that you've done your research, and you will see that the common thread is that people are in a hurry to get their work permit issued for various reasons, such as, for example, as you and I both know, some of the work permits are issued with a restriction. For example, you can't work in a healthcare related field if you have not completed your medical exams. So once you've actually satisfied those requirements, you can ask for that to be lifted. In theory, you should be able to apply for a new work permit from immigration directly through the online portals, but that takes time, typically weeks, if not months. And the best way to actually, get a new work permit in those circumstances is sometimes to flagpole. But again, putting this with a massive caveat, a warning, so to speak, that if you are going to do this, make sure that you have a very clean slate. Otherwise, it could go very nasty for you.
Hmm. Yeah, speaking about that, I actually saw one interview recently from Omni News where there's this couple who tried fact polling. I think their work visas were about to be expired already, and then when they got to the border, things went wrong. Like I think
Mm.
the officer said, "Okay, buy your ticket back home now because I'm refusing your entry." Something like that. Can you tell me more about that? What happened there? What are the
Right.
usual mistakes that happens during flag polling?
Well, to be very clear, I am not the lawyer who represented those individuals who made this attempt. I believe another lawyer did assist them in this regard, or they may have sought the assistance of counsel after the incident occurred. They did not reach out to me. However, I was interviewed by Omni in that regard to basically do an explanation, as we are trying to do now in a more long format, I suppose, on YouTube that would be easily more consumable by folks such as your viewers. In that regard, I don't know all of the facts of that particular case, but from what I understand is that they tried to get their new work permits reissued because they needed valid permits, for example, to pursue further employment. And I believe they had a child who needed a new study permit. And Fact is, if they apply from inside Canada, no issue would have occurred if their paperwork were in order. However, they may have been in a hurry because they may be trying to remove certain restrictions or conditions on their original permits, right? And let's be honest, while it is true that you can go on maintained status while you're inside Canada, it does create a bit of uncertainty. And there are some employers who are not as willing to, let's say, take the risk of taking your word for it that you do have the authorization to work. So some employers are just finicky like that. So in their circumstance, I believe that's really what motivated them to make an attempt to flagpole. And after doing some research on social media, which, by the way, if you do that, make sure that you're doing it right. Consult with a professional. And the reality is, they got an officer who exercised their discretion to not really help. Because it is a discretionary power at the end of the day, they could turn you away. I believe in that story they alleged, issues of discrimination and whatnot. I'm not going to get into that because That's easily, that's very hard to prove. Quite frankly, it's a he said, she said kind of situation. But regardless of that, an officer does have the obligation to process. However, I believe CBSA also reserves a right to refuse and instruct you to apply from inside Canada. Now, with respect to the instructions to purchase tickets right away, it does happen in severe circumstances if you're not ready and if you don't know how to answer the questions properly. And in a lot of cases, Daniel, when we assist some of our clients to do flagpole, again, as I mentioned, this is an option of last resort for a lot of folks, especially for those who have, uh, you know, um, very limited options to extend, for example. So we really only consider this if there are no other options. And more often than not, we're on standby. And sometimes we even accompany our clients to the border, just because it could be a very dangerous maneuver if one thing were to go wrong. And as a final point, I promise, because I know this is getting a bit of a monologue, we did assist one client once from a country that had a fairly strong passport. But then again, we decided to assist because the case was a bit complicated. And true enough, the border services officer was not really familiar with the type of work permit that we were asking for the client. So the unfamiliarity created a lot of uncertainty. So us being there to assist the client and to assist the officer was very much a facilitative thing. So again, it really is a strategic move that you will have to weigh, and it's better to be done with the assistance of counsel. Can't stress that enough. And this isn't so much to actually like make a buck out of this. To be quite frank, and if maybe a bit cynical about this, if I actually wanted to have more clients to assist and for more money, if this was a profit motive on my part, quite frankly, do it. And if you make a mistake, it's actually harder to untangle. It becomes more expensive. It's more money for me, quite frankly. So yeah, at the end of the day, like, if you're going to do this, make sure that you've done your research. Make sure that you've actually consulted with an immigration professional, and not just anyone. Consult with someone. A lot of us do have experience with flagpoling, but not everyone has a tremendous amount of flagpoling experience in part as a part of their practice.
Thank you so much, Lou. And for those of you who want to get in touch with Lou, I'll put a link in the description below. Get a consultation from Lou and his team. You'll get a really good discount if you use that link. And again, we highly recommend Lou's services to help with this one. Right, Lou, since we're chatting about it, I'm curious who who should actually do flag polling? Is it just temporary residents whose visas are expiring soon as a
Mhm.
last resort, or who can do this and who's qualified to do this?
That's a really good question. Normally, I would say if you can avoid flagpoling, avoid it like the plague. I've been, repeating this often with clients who ask me about this, with consultations who ask me about this. And for the same reason that I mentioned earlier, that if one thing goes wrong, everything just like falls apart and it could be very expensive for you. So if you do have to do it, make sure that you have no other options. So if you're in Canada and your permit is about to expire, as long as you submit a new permit application, so let's say in the context of a work permit, um, you want to submit that before the expiry of your current permit. And what happens is, even if your original permit expires on its face, what happens is you're on maintained status until your new work permit application is adjudicated from within Canada. And essentially, all the conditions, all of your authorization, such as to work in Canada for the same employer, for example, if it's employer specific, or if it's an open work permit for any employer in Canada, uh, the status and authorization is maintained, right? So there is a big advantage to actually applying from inside Canada. However, I do understand why people want to rush to get their work permits because, say, for example, if you're on maintained status, sometimes it puts you on immigration limbo. What if you need to leave the country? What if you need to leave Canada for an emergency? Then you'll have to fly out without a permit. And when you come back, you may not necessarily have the same authorizations. So, say for example, if you're coming in from an open work permit to an extension to another open work permit, and it expires, or on its face it's expired, and your status is maintained because you have a live and pending application, and in the process of adjudicating your second permit, you needed to leave for your home country, and then you've decided to come back. In that situation, you may not necessarily be able to come back to Canada with the same authorization. So it's not maintained because you leave Canada. The maintained status only works if you're inside Canada. But that's different from, say, for example, the case of a PGWP application. So if, say, for example, you finish your program of studies in end of April of 2024, and then your study permit expires in end of July, for example, and you submitted your PGWP application, let's say first way of May, that means that you could start working full time for any employer until your PGWP application is adjudicated. Now, can you leave Canada? The answer is yes, absolutely. And when you return to Canada, do you have the same authorization? It depends. When are you coming back? So if you're coming back before the expiry of your study permit on its face, chances are you'll be able to maintain your status, your authorization, even if you've left Canada and even if the PGWP application has not been adjudicated yet. But if you leave Canada, let's say second week of May, once you've filed your PGWP, and let's say your study permit again expires end of July, and then you return in August, an officer may allow you in, but your authorization to work could be questionable at that point. An officer at the port of entry could potentially limit your ability to work because of the non-adjudication of your PGWP at the time. However, it rarely happens because PGWP applications, especially now post-pandemic, processing times have more or less normalized. And PGWPs, if your file is simple, they're typically adjudicated very quickly, despite what the processing times are stating on IRCC's website. So again, to go back to your question, who usually needs to do this? Well, people who are in a hurry, especially if you're changing employers. So, say, for example, Daniel, you're on a closed work permit, working for ABC, and you found new employment with XYZ. Uh, you'll need to change your work permit, right? Because it's employer specific. So, in that situation, if I were handling your file, I may advise you, okay, you have two options. You can apply online. However, you need to wait until the new work permit is processed. And that may take 3 months, for example. So your employer may not be willing to wait. Your new employer may not be willing to wait, right? And so this is why a lot of folks make an attempt for flagpoling. And in that situation, that new work permit, as long as the papers are in order, you could potentially be able to get your new work permit at the border if you do a flagpole maneuver.
Wow. Look, that
A lot
was,
of info.
yeah, no, I was gonna say, if you're watching this, I can't stress this enough. This is something you don't want to wing this. This seems complicated based on your specific scenario. I wouldn't just rely on, to be honest, if your future, your employment, your career is on the line, I wouldn't just read some Facebook post about this. I would highly recommend to seek help from an immigration professional like Lou to help you with this decision. Okay.
Mhm.
Lou, from what you've seen in the past and from your experience, what are the most common pitfalls and mistakes that applicants make when flagpoling,
Mhm.
and how can they
Well, a
be?
lot of folks think that they can flagpole to apply for a study permit. That is a big no-no. So notice that so far in our conversations, we've talked about flagpoling and talking about work permit applications because the only people who are authorized to apply for a study permit, and note the word apply for a study permit at the port of entry, are U.S. citizens essentially who are crossing into Canada. Or they could already be in Canada and then they could decide to flagpole, touch the flagpole at the US side and then come back to Canada. They are authorized under the regulations to apply for a study permit. I've had some clients do this in the same vein that Canadians are actually authorized to apply for their their study visas when they're entering the United States. So it's reciprocal. But some people seem to think that you can flagpole for your study permit. That is not correct. And I've seen some people do this for their children. Sometimes they get away with it if the CBSA officer is not in the know. that actually you can't do that and you should be applying from inside Canada. Sometimes what the officers do who know better, they would issue a visitor record in lieu of a study permit for their dependents who are attending K to 12. Because actually, fun story, you don't actually need a study permit to study in Canada if you're attending K to 12 as long as you're on a visitor record. Although a lot of folks apply for a study permit, especially if they're coming in from visa required countries. So there are some nuances here where you can apply for a visitor record and you're allowed to actually study. And usually people who are visa exempt to enter Canada, they get away with it. But if you have a weaker passport, think again, make sure that you're getting proper advice because this can go down really nastily for you. And to your point, again, like, with regard to, you know, common mistakes. So study permits, for example, sometimes people think that if they're out of status, that they can do a flagpole maneuver and apply simply for a new work permit. Not necessarily the case. So typically what happens in those situations is that if the officer is kind enough and you're asking for a work permit, they do a double issuance. First, they'll issue a temporary resident permit to allow you to overcome your out of status situation and then issue a permit in your favor. They do have that ability. So again, a temporary resident permit, not a visa. A TRP is what allows you to overcome non-compliance. And if you've been out of status inside Canada, you're non-compliant, right? So in order to be compliant again, or to overcome the non-compliance rather, an officer will have to issue that TRP, including with the TRP, they could issue the work permit. So it's a bit of a complicated movement. As you mentioned, you rightly mentioned, this is very case specific. So if your situation is unique, and usually it is, you need to make sure that you're applying for the right documents. And think of the border officer who has to process hundreds of applications, or people who are trying to get into Canada. So if you come there and ask for something and you're not even sure what you're asking for, they might not necessarily like you. So you're already strike one in the officer's eyes, right? And then your documents are incomplete, strike two. So they're not going to like you. And if they're not a fan of you, you're going to have a hard time.
Oh no. What is I'm curious if you have information. Well, of course you do. You've been preparing clients for this. What should people expect during the interview or review process at the border when flagpoling? How does
Mm,
that conversation go? Is it a long
right.
conversation? What happens there?
Well, I want to talk about it in two heads. First is, let's assume everything is regular, that you're not out of status, that you're applying for a replacement work permit because you changed employer. That's the most common situation. If you're doing that, assuming all of your paperwork are complete, they're complete, the officer is going to ask questions about your compliance in the past. For example, that you've not overstayed, that you've complied with the terms of your original permit, your original visa, everything is in order. And then they're going to ask you, secondly, about your qualifications for the new job. Even if people generally think that if they pass the LMIA stage and that the employer has given them the job offer, for example, you're not out of the woods. An officer who does immigration, who issues the work permit, they do have the ability and the discretion to scrutinize that all over again. It's under the regulations. It's baked. It doesn't mean that you're good on the eyes of the employer, the eyes of ESDC for your LMIA, doesn't mean that you're out of the woods just yet. You need to convince the officer that you actually are qualified to work that job that you received an offer for example. So that could be in question. So it's not a bad idea to actually bring copies of the documents that were submitted as a part of the LMIA, as a part of what normally would be a part of a work permit application, such as your credentials. So if you're claiming that you're um, working as a software engineer, I would bring a CV, for example, and proof that you can actually, work the job that you've been offered to do, right? So those are the common questions that they're asking. Now, in that is in the situation of regularity. As I said, that's the first head. The second head is, what if you're out of status? So some of the questions that they will definitely ask is, how did you enter Canada? and how did you fall out of status? And they're going to try to find through an interview. They'll ask series of questions to you at the port of entry, which can be very much nerve-wracking, right? What happened? Uh, why did you not comply? What were your efforts to actually get back in compliance, for example? If there was abuse from the employer, they will potentially ask for that as well. And you could potentially have some options. So it really is case specific. So there's no general answer to a general question such as that, because even if it's a general question, unfortunately, um, it will depend on your situation. So if you've been a victim of domestic violence, for example, you may have options that may not necessarily be available to the person next to you who's applying for a work permit as part of, say, for example, a family whose principal finished their studies in Canada. In other words, on a PGWP, right? So this can be very complicated. I would say, get your paperwork in order, and then if you're still in doubt, absolutely, do not be shy. Consult with an immigration lawyer.
Hmm. I mean, I was getting goosebumps while you were saying that because it seems like an episode of, I'm not sure what that show is, Border Control or Border Patrol.
Border security, I
Border
believe that's what you.
security?
Yeah.
That is nerve wracking. I'm curious, Lou, are there any other sick emergency measures or alternative solutions that some people can pursue to extend their stay in Canada if flag polling is not viable?
Well, they could, in theory, apply for a temporary resident permit from inside Canada if they're out of status, for example, if they're non-compliant, and meet the test to actually demonstrate to the officer why you deserve a TRP, and with that TRP, you can actually apply for a work permit as well from inside Canada. The problem with this, and again, it really boils down to the original question that you have, is it's very slow if you do this from inside Canada. It used to be that it took like 1 to 2 years. Now I'm seeing applications being acknowledged for receipt months later, typically 4 to 5 months, which, by the way, that's very fast for TRP applications. But as you can imagine, that's very slow because what else are you going to be doing inside Canada, right? If you can't work. And of course, if you are my client, I would advise that you stop working because you don't want to be continuing action that makes you non-compliant from the perspective of the law. So, what are the other alternatives? Well, you can always leave Canada and apply from outside, let's say from your home country, for example, if you're out of status. But typically, there is a regulatory bar. So, for example, if you're out of status, starting the month of May, for example, and then you decide to leave the country by June, you have to wait for 6 months until after to apply for your next permit. Because, for example, if it's a case of a work permit, an officer is not allowed under the regulations to issue a work permit if you're non-compliance, if it has not stopped for at least 6 months. Then again, you can overcome this with a TRP. So you are free to submit a TRP application from outside Canada, but you better be able to back it up, right? Because it does it's not an agency, but it's almost like an agency. An agency stands for humanitarian and compassionate grounds, right? So you need to have a compelling ground. You need to be able to convince the officer that you know these were like tough times. For example, I was forced into it because, let's say, there was employer abuse, for example. So you might get a sympathetic ear on the eye from the side of the officer, and they may issue a TRP in your favor in these situations. So best to check what your options are first before you actually do anything.
Mm. Wow, this is next level stuff, Lou. It's like it's getting very specific. I'm curious. There is a lot of changes are happening in Canadian immigration, changes in the policy. Are there any recent changes in the policy that could impact the practice of flag polling?
Yes. For example, C41 work permits, or sorry, C42 work permits, meaning open work permits for spouses of international students, have been limited to certain types of post-secondary students, for example. So a lot of folks, if they have like, if the primary applicant is an international student in Canada, in theory, their spouse could follow as a visitor, and if they want, they could do a flagpole maneuver and apply for a work permit. Say, for example, Niagara. I've seen that happen. But obviously, if they're no longer qualified for a C-42 open work permit, then they can't do this anymore. So we do have to take into considerations the policy shifts that are happening and that are, I believe, continuing. They're going to continue to happen in the next few months as the government tries to adjust the temporary resident program in Canada. Um, you need to be mindful of these changes because these may affect your options for flagpoling. So again, and this isn't an ad or anything. This is really PSA. You may want to consult with an immigration lawyer who has experience in flagpoling before actually doing it.
100%. Guys, again, if you want to chat with Lou and his team, we have a consultation link, special consultation link for Bay and Daniel YouTube channel viewers. Click that below. And again, you can have a great consultation with Lou about your specific situation and what you can do. All right. Lou, to wrap it all up, let's final question here. What is your best advice for people who are thinking about doing flagpoling? Like, what is the specific tip that will
Well,
help them become successful in it?
right. If you want to do flagpoling, again, as I said, it really sounds self-serving at this point. Consult with an immigration lawyer because it is not a move to be taken lightly. If it goes wrong bad. A lot of people have successes with it, but if you're the unlucky person who gets that luck of the draw, it can go very ugly. The best preventive way to actually, the preventive way to not even consider flagpoling, I think is the best, is by planning ahead, like making sure that you understand which permits you're applying for ahead, months in advance, sometimes years in advance. All right, because if you have complete documentation, if you understand the type of work permit that you're applying for, the type of study permit that you're applying for, more often than not, you wouldn't even need to flagpole at all. So it's a question of organization, and in that regard, actually, having the assistance of counsel has experience in transitioning temporary residents to another type of temporary residence in Canada or even permanent residence is not a bad idea, especially now that the policies are shifting. It's becoming more competitive, not just for permanent residency, but also for temporary residence in Canada. So not a bad idea to actually consult. And I know that there's kind of like this tendency these days to kind of like brush aside expertise, for example. But there's still wisdom to admit that, this may be beyond yourself. I personally still go to a doctor when I have health problems. So if you have legal problems, it's not a bad idea to go to a lawyer, quite frankly. And, for those who think that it's actually super expensive right away, think again and look at that link that Daniel was saying earlier. There is a discount for this. Please take advantage of this.
100%. And if you're, I mean, I was referring Lou, full transparency. I was referring Lou to someone from my friends, and they're like, I don't really have, I don't really want to spend more for lawyer services. Let me just do things on my own. Things went really bad for that person, right? Because again, you don't want to skimp on things that'll affect your future here in Canada. You don't want to skip on those things. You want to ensure that your initial investment in going here and all the time you spent here will not go to waste. All right. So again,
Mm.
check the link in the comment section in the description below. Lou, thank you so much for joining us again. Again, another extremely valuable session. We'll definitely see you next time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me again, and see you at the next.
Thanks, Lou. Bye.